Hello everyone, and welcome to this year's webinar for the Tracking the Sun Report 2018 edition. My name is Naeem Dargoos. I'm a researcher in the Electricity Markets and Policy Group, and I'll be kicking this webinar off with a few kind of housekeeping items. So the first thing to note is that the webinar will be recorded and posted online at the conclusion of the webinar. Also, you'll notice in the bottom left corner of your screen, there should be a question and answer box. And in that box, if you could just enter any questions you have as the webinar goes on, and at the conclusion of the webinar, we'll reserve maybe 10-15 minutes to answer any of those questions. So again, ask them as the webinar goes on, or at the conclusion of the webinar, and we'll get to them, as many of them as we can. Without further ado, I will pass it on to my colleague, Galen Barbos.
All right, thanks, Naeem, and thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. So let's see, before jumping into the presentation, I do just want to call your attention to the URL at the bottom of the slide here, trackingthesun.lbl.gov. You can go to download the report itself, as well as a recording of this webinar and the slide deck. And that's also where we posted a public version of the data set underlying our analysis, which you can feel free to download and dig into should you wish. I'd also just want to acknowledge the Department of Energy Solar Energy Technologies Office for funding this work and continuing to support our efforts with Tracking the Sun. So, Tracking the Sun, as many of you may know, if you've seen previous versions of the report, is focused on installed price trends for distributed PV. And it's really the counterpart to our other annual solar report, which focuses on utility scale projects. And so by distributed PV, here we're including both residential systems as well as non-residential systems that are either roof-mounted or ground-mounted up to 5 megawatts in size. Anything bigger than that is utility scale and is covered in our other report. Tracking the Sun is very much an historical analysis. This year's edition focuses on projects installed through the end of 2017, along with some preliminary data for the first half of 2018. And in analyzing this data, we focus on essentially three things. The first is just the underlying characteristics of the projects in the data set. And that information is useful context for understanding some of the pricing trends, but it's also just interesting in its own right, given that our data set is fairly comprehensive. And so these project characteristics provide a pretty good indication of the larger U.S. distributed PV market. In characterizing the installed pricing trends, we focus first on trends in the national median installed price, both long-term and more recent trends, and talk about some of the bigger picture drivers for those high-level trends. And then finally, and this ends up being a pretty substantial part of the analysis, we dig into pricing variability across projects and show how prices can differ depending on various attributes of the particular project, as we've sort of listed here. So before delving into the results, though, it can be helpful just to give a little bit of background on our underlying data sample. So first, just to make sure there's no confusion about terminology, in characterizing the installed price of PV, we're talking about the upfront dollar per watt price paid by the system owner. And that system owner could either be the site host or it could be a third party. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next few slides. And just also to be clear, in talking about the install price, we're referring to the gross price prior to any incentives or tax credits. And so for perhaps obvious reasons, the installed price is not necessarily the same as the underlying cost to the entity who's developing and selling the project. Throughout the report, everything is expressed in terms of real 2017 dollars and DC watts, unless otherwise noted. And then finally, we generally distinguish between residential and non-residential systems, where again, the non-residential projects essentially go up to 5 megawatts. And in many cases, we further disaggregate those non-residential systems into small versus large, where we use 500 kilowatts as the cutoff between the two. So the data underlying our analysis come from various state agencies and utilities that administer PV incentive programs and SREC registration systems and interconnection processes. This is project level data. As I'll show in a couple slides, it consists of data for about 1.3 million individual projects. Some of that data is already in the public domain. So for example, some of you may be familiar with California's currently interconnected data set. Basically, we're taking those kinds of data sets and synthesizing them together and kind of standardizing a lot of the fields and information. These data, as you can imagine, have some limitations, and it's just important to be aware of and acknowledge some of those. So first and foremost is that these data are self-reported, and so there's always some potential for inconsistencies because of that. Second, the data, as I've noted, are historical. These are based on installed projects, primarily through the end of last year, and so there's definitely some lag here relative to what you might find if, say, you were to go out and get a quote today for some system installed at some future date. And that lag is generally going to be more pronounced for larger systems where there's a longer development timeline. And then finally, we end up scrubbing out of our data sample a pretty large fraction of third-party owned systems, which I'll talk more about on the next slide. But the key thing to note here is just that those systems that get scrubbed out tend to be for some of the largest installers in the country. And so the final sample that we use for our analysis is somewhat skewed towards kind of smaller and medium-sized installers, though certainly we do have some pretty large installers represented as well. We spend a lot of time on this project cleaning up the data and standardizing it. I won't bore you with all of those details here, but I will just highlight in particular our treatment of third-party owned systems, as I kind of alluded to on the previous slide. And so the key distinction here is between integrated and non-integrated TPO providers. So integrated providers are where you've got a single company that provides both the installation service and the customer financing. And in these cases, the prices that are getting reported are typically some sort of appraised value. And that's simply because there's no sale of the individual system that occurs, and therefore no price formation. And so for our analysis, we don't want to mix and match appraised values with transaction prices, and so we scrub those systems out of the analysis sample that we use when describing installed pricing trends. In contrast to those integrated TPO systems, non-integrated TPO providers are where you've got two different entities, a customer finance provider on the one hand and an installation contractor on the other. And in those cases, there is an actual sale of the system between those two entities and a transaction price associated with that sale. And that's what then generally gets reported to the various entities who in turn provide us with data. Now those prices are not necessarily exactly comparable to what an individual site host would pay under a cash sale transaction, but they're similar enough to retain in our analysis, and we'll kind of show later on how the prices can differ between those TPO systems that we retain in our analysis and host-owned systems. So here's where you can get some sense for the size of our data sample and how that compares to the larger population of systems installed in the U.S. What we call the full sample, those are the middle orange bars in the figure, is what we have prior to removing any systems from the data set. So prior to scrubbing out the integrated TPO systems and prior to removing systems that are missing installed price data, for example. And that full sample consists of about 1.3 million individual distributed PV systems installed through the end of last year. And that represents a little over 80% of all systems in the U.S. Installed through that point, and about 75% of systems installed last year. We then winnow that sample down by removing the integrated TPO systems and systems with missing installed price data and a few other categories. And that residual sample is what we then call our analysis sample, and that corresponds to the yellow bars in the figure and consists of roughly 770,000 projects installed through the end of last year. And so that's what we're primarily focusing on in our analysis, at least in the portions of our analysis where we're looking at installed pricing trends. So our overall data collection covers 29 states, though we only actually get installed price data for 25, but still a pretty broad geographical coverage. The figures here are a little bit dense, but basically what each one does is it compares the geographical distribution of the overall U.S. market to both our full sample in the middle and then the analysis sample, which is the third of these kind of sequential sets of bars. And there's just a few key themes that I'll mention here. The first is if you look at the dark blue bar segments, you can see that, which are California, you can see that California definitely dominates our sample as it does the overall national market. And that does have some implications for the trend that we present later on national median installed prices, as I'll talk about further. The second thing to note here is that what we've called out specifically the largest individual state markets, and you can see that in general our full sample has pretty good coverage among those larger state markets. There are a few exceptions: Hawaii, Maryland, and Minnesota principally. The smaller and kind of more mid-sized state markets, which are consolidated in these figures in the light blue others category, that's really actually where most of the gap in our sample coverage exists, and there are a variety of reasons for that. And then last, you can see that our market coverage for residential systems on the left-hand side is a little bit stronger than our coverage for the non-residential sector. So one of the new things to Tracking the Sun this year, and something that we plan to do a bit more of in the future, is to devote more real estate to simply describing various features of the projects in our data sample. As I mentioned before, we do this partially to provide context for the installed pricing trends, but also simply because these project characteristics are potentially interesting and informative in their own right in terms of providing a picture of some broader market trends. So this slide, which describes trends among various technical characteristics of distributed PV projects, is very dense, but let me just note a few things about each of the figures here. So on the upper left is the trend in system sizes, where you can see that residential systems in particular have been increasing in size quite steadily over our analysis time frame. The non-residential trends there are a little bit quirky. For non-residential, for smaller non-residential systems, you can see that those actually are generally much smaller than the 500 kW threshold, typically more like 40 kilowatts or so. And then for the large non-residential systems, you can see that those have also growing in size over time as well. Again, keeping in mind that those systems are all generally less than 5 megawatts. Somewhat related to the system size trends are the trends in PV module efficiencies shown on the lower left. As you can see there, median module efficiencies have also been growing pretty steadily over time. Over the last year of our analysis period, that growth may partly reflect a pretty dramatic uptick in the share of monocrystalline modules in our sample, which are generally more efficient than polycrystalline modules. But in general, both mono and poly module efficiencies have been growing over time. And these module efficiency trends partly explain the growth in system sizes, at least in kind of space-constrained applications where higher modules allow for a larger system capacity within a given physical footprint. On the upper right, we show the growth of module-level power electronics, which includes both microinverters and DC optimizers. I'd simply note here that these technologies have basically taken over the residential market, with most of the growth over the past few years coming from DC optimizers. Adoption is lower, but still pretty significant among small non-residential systems, but is largely non-existent among the class of larger non-residential systems. And that partly just reflects the fact that some of the benefits of module-level power electronics in terms of optimizing PV performance where you've got multiple roof orientations or partial shading, those benefits tend to be more applicable for residential or small commercial systems than for larger non-residential systems where you're often dealing with, a single large flat rooftop and minimal shading. And then finally here on the bottom right, we show the share of ground-mounted systems and systems with tracking. So not surprisingly, those numbers are pretty small for residential systems. Among small non-residential systems, you can see that ground mounting has become a bit more prevalent over the past few years, but still most of those systems are roof-mounted. And then for large non-residential systems, basically almost all of those, or 80% in the last year, were ground-mounted, and about 10% had tracking. Those numbers can definitely bounce around a bit from year to year. So turning here to trends in system ownership and host customer segments, on the top, we see how the TPO share has risen dramatically across our sample and then more recently began to decline as other financing options have become more widely available, and this certainly sort of mirrors the broader market trends. Then in the bottom figure where we dig into the composition of non-residential systems in our sample, you can see that depending on the state, about 20% or more of these non-residential systems were installed at tax-exempt customer sites. So these are schools, government facilities, nonprofit entities like churches. And not surprisingly, third-party ownership is also more common for those entities than for for-profit commercial site hosts. And the reason there is just that tax-exempt entities generally aren't able to directly monetize the various tax benefits for distributed solar, and so they rely on third parties to capture those benefits and potentially pass some of those along. So now we get to really the core of the analysis and delve into some of the installed pricing trends, looking first at how national median prices have evolved over time. So on the left here are the long-term pricing trends through the end of last year. And you can see there just how much prices have fallen over the past 17 years. And you can see, sort of different periods within these trajectories where prices have either fallen quite rapidly, as they did over roughly the 2009 to 2013 time frame, or other periods where the price decline has been slower. And certainly since 2014 or so, we've been on a fairly steady but slow downward trajectory, with prices generally falling by about 5 to 10% per year, as they did over the last year of the analysis. And then preliminary data for the first half of this year, shown on the right, basically show the continuation of those trends, with about a 10-cent per watt drop for both residential and smaller non-residential systems. So there are a few reasons for why the price declines have slowed since kind of that period from 2009 to 2013 when they were falling by basically $1 per watt each year. The main driver is just simply the underlying trajectory of module prices, and we'll show that on the next slide. But beyond that, it just becomes more difficult to continue finding opportunities for cost reductions as some of the low-hanging fruit are picked, and customer acquisition can potentially become more difficult as the market moves beyond those early adopters. We also know that some of the national installation companies are focusing more on profitability than on building market share, and that certainly can affect their pricing. And then you've also got some portion of the host-owned systems that are loan financed and where various fees, interest rate buy-down fees or loan origination fees can, at least in some cases, be rolled into the overall system price, and that could be kind of dampening the overall rate of decline. So the data that we collect for this report doesn't include any underlying component level costs, but we still can compare sort of the top line system level pricing trends to various published benchmark prices for module and inverter pricing in order to see how those component level pricing trends have then impacted system level pricing. And that's what we've done here, where we show the installed price trajectory for residential systems, that's the green line at the top, along with module and inverter index prices, which are the blue and purple lines. And then the dashed orange line is just the residual term, basically everything else. So, all the other balance of systems costs and the whole variety of soft costs as well. So looking over the long term here, total residential system prices fell by about $8 a watt. About 60% of that decline is due to falling module and inverter costs. And the remaining 40% is then due to the reduction in all of those balance of systems and soft costs in aggregate. Over the last year, our comparison here is a little bit less precise, but again, it would seem to be sort of a similar split, roughly half and half between kind of hardware costs and soft costs. At least in thinking about the long-term trends here, one of the big drivers for the declining residential balance of systems and soft costs has been the growth in system sizes and module efficiencies, which we saw earlier. And the logic here is that, with a larger system, you can spread those fixed project costs over a larger number of watts and therefore reduce your cost per watt. And in the case of higher efficiency modules, you potentially can kind of shrink your physical project footprint and reduce some of the area related costs that scale with the physical dimensions of the system. And so using some modeled PV cost relationships that our colleagues at NREL developed, we estimate that about 40% or so of the total long-term drop in balance of systems and soft costs are associated with increasing system sizes and module efficiencies. So certainly not the whole story, but an important part of it. One other important dynamic that's been at play over the long term has been just the steady ratcheting down of financial incentives for distributed PV. And here we're looking specifically at rebates and performance-based incentives, kind of the traditional mainstays of many PV incentive programs. And as you can see, those incentives have ramped down quite significantly over the long run and have been really either eliminated in whole or reduced to well below, say, 50 cents a watt in the major state markets. Now that trend of declining incentives has, of course, partly been a response to the decline in installed prices and also a response to kind of other incentives emerging, like the lifting of the cap on the residential ITC back in 2009, or the creation of SREC markets in a number of states. But this declining incentive trend has also arguably helped to kind of motivate and stimulate further installed price reductions as installers are forced to kind of cut costs and prices in order to remain competitive. I think, maybe the most important point to stress here, though, is simply that these incentive reductions have offset to a significant degree the corresponding drop in installed prices. So looking at just the 5 states shown here, the long-term drop in incentives equates to anywhere from about 2/3 to 100% of the drop in installed prices over the same time period. So even though consumers are seeing dramatically lower prices for PV than they once were, the overall customer economics may not have improved by nearly as much, even though certainly it often has still improved to some degree. So we've talked so far about the temporal trends in installed prices, but we haven't said much about what those prices are in absolute terms. And here we identify the specific national median prices for systems installed in 2017. Those are shown by the colored bars here. So $3.70 a watt for residential systems, $3.10 for small non-residential, and $2.20 for large non-residential. Also shown in the figure for comparison purposes are various other benchmark prices, and these include modeled system prices, as well as price quote data from several sources, and average costs reported by several of the larger national installers. And the one thing that kind of jumps out most immediately here is that most of these other benchmarks are definitely below the national median prices from our data set. And there are a number of reasons for that, some of which will become more clear as we progress through some of the remaining material in the presentation. For example, as we've already seen, California dominates the data sample, and we'll show later that California, as well as some of the other big state markets, are also among the most expensive, which tends to pull the national median price up. Some of these other benchmarks, however, may be based on sort of lower cost or more average cost states. Sizable fractions of the systems in our data sample include premium efficiency modules, or are installed by relatively small firms, and that can also contribute to some of the discrepancies here between these national median values and some of the other benchmarks. The bottom line, though, is that most of these other benchmarks here, they're not actually totally out of line with our data. It's just really more that they align more closely with, say, the 20th percentile pricing level rather than the median prices, and as such, maybe a little bit more reflective of, say, best-in-class or turnkey type systems. We can also compare our national median prices in the U.S. to system pricing in other countries. And that comparison, as we've shown here, really drives the point home that prices in the U.S. are really quite high relative to other countries. So looking, for example, just at the residential systems in green, you've got some other major national markets like Germany and Australia, where prices are basically half of what they are in the U.S. And in trying to understand the reason for these differences, unfortunately, there's probably no single reason. I think we can safely assert that it primarily reflects differences in soft costs, given that prices for PV modules and inverters just don't differ by that much between the U.S. and other countries, certainly not by any amount that would come close to explaining these overall system price differences. And so really that just leaves soft costs as kind of the logical source of these overall pricing differences. And those soft cost differences can reflect a combination of different factors: permitting and interconnection processes, labor rates perhaps, and just maybe differences in the nature of the solar industry in some of these different countries. I think regardless, the one obvious conclusion here is that there's seemingly quite a bit of legroom left for system pricing in the U.S. to come down, given what we're seeing in other countries. Less clear is exactly how we get there. So we focused so far on national median prices. What I'd like to do now is focus in on the variability in system pricing, which is perhaps maybe even a little bit more informative in certain ways. And if nothing else, just helps to kind of highlight that pricing for many systems is really well below those national median values. So to begin, we see here the pricing distribution of systems installed last year in 2017. And you can just get some kind of obvious visual sense for the wide spread in pricing. And that spread has persisted over time, even as PV markets have continued to mature. That variability in pricing reflects a whole host of different drivers. Drivers related to system sizing and design, related to attributes of the installers and the customers, and then also various aspects of just the broader market and policy environment, things like incentive levels and labor rates and the competitiveness of local installer markets, etc. We'll explore kind of some of those drivers in the remainder of the presentation using relatively kind of simple descriptive statistics, but really to kind of do this question justice requires more sophisticated statistical analysis where you can control for correlations among all of these different drivers. And in fact, we have done some of that in concert with a number of academic partners and with some colleagues at NREL. The slide here lists most of those studies. I'm not going to go through all of this. I just think I would just wanted to highlight the existence of these various studies, which in general rely on the Tracking the Sun data set, but as I mentioned, apply some more advanced statistical methods to really try to tease out the effects of individual drivers. And these studies have definitely found some interesting results related to the effects on pricing from things like incentive levels, installer company size and experience, and also local permitting processes. So if you're interested, these studies are all posted on our website. In some cases now, simple descriptive statistics can be just fine and can be informative, especially in cases where you're dealing with drivers that have a fairly consistent and clear-cut effect. Probably the most obvious example of that is system size. And so what we've shown here is how system prices differ. Well, we've already shown how system prices differ between residential and non-residential systems. Here we've kind of parsed that out even further to look at how pricing varies across system sizes within each of those groups. And as you can see, very much the kind of trend you might expect, with quite clear economies of scale among both residential and non-residential systems. And those scale economies are largely a function of just being able to spread fixed project costs over a larger number of watts. And so, for example, while the median residential system size was about 6 kilowatts in 2017, there were also a lot of systems that were smaller than 4 kilowatts, and also a lot of systems that were bigger than 10 kilowatts. And so you can see in the figure on the left how that can potentially swing the system pricing. And that's part of what drives the overall variability in system prices that we observe. Pricing also varies quite a bit across states, particularly for residential and smaller non-residential systems, as we show in the figures here. So for example, among residential systems installed last year, median prices ranged from a low of $260 a watt to a high of $450 a watt across the various states shown here. And a particular note, as I mentioned before, is that the larger state markets, so California, Massachusetts, and New York in particular, also tend to be relatively high priced. and that then pulls that national median price, the red dashed line, upward. Most states, though, are actually below that national median, or many states are. In terms of the reasons for why prices vary across states, it's in some sense the kind of the same set of reasons for why prices vary more generally. For example, system sizing and design can vary from state to state. The installer base can vary from state to state. I would, I guess, also just acknowledge that when looking at these state-level results, there can be some idiosyncratic behavior happening, and this is especially the case for some of the smaller states where perhaps a single installer whose exceptionally low or high prices could then be driving the overall statewide median. I mean, that's actually what's happening at the two bookends in the residential figure, where it's really mostly a single installer that's kind of responsible for the particularly low or high prices there. But beyond those kind of idiosyncratic issues, there are definitely some real and fundamental factors at play related to kind of the larger regulatory and market conditions. So I described earlier how we treat third-party owned or TPO systems in our analysis, where we basically scrub out the systems installed by integrated TPO providers, but retain systems where there's some intermediate sale between an installation contractor and the third-party owner, and that it's the transaction price of that that gets reported and included in our analysis. So here we see how the prices for those retained TPO systems compare to the prices for host-owned systems. Focusing on the figure in the upper left, if you look specifically at residential systems, you can see that over the last 3 years, TPO systems have been consistently and pretty significantly lower priced than host-owned systems. For non-residential systems, on the other hand, there really hasn't been any consistent difference between TPO and host-owned systems. When it comes to the residential systems, though, there are probably a few reasons for why prices are lower for TPO than for host-owned systems. The most obvious, perhaps, is simply that TPO companies are generally going to have much greater leverage and buying power than your typical homeowner when it comes to negotiating low prices. And then in addition to that, in some cases, the TPO provider may be performing the customer acquisition function or other administrative functions, and so what they're buying in some cases is really just labor and materials associated with the system itself. And so there is definitely some apples to oranges here when comparing between TPO and host-owned systems, at least for some subset of the TPO systems. In addition, there is some evidence to suggest that TPO systems tend to be somewhat more standardized and straightforward in their design, and so that could also be contributing to the pricing difference. And then last, you've got this issue that I kind of mentioned in passing earlier, where for some of the host-owned systems that are loan financed, there could be some additional financing fees that are getting rolled into the overall installed price. So we'll take a momentary break from bar graphs and look at how pricing varies across individual installers. And what we've done here is take the 100 installers with the most host-owned systems in 2017. Those are on the left, and the 100 installers with the most with the most residential TPO systems in 2017. Those are on the right. And then for each of those installers, we show their median price. Those are the dots, and the percentile range. Those are the shaded areas. And the figures here just really kind of help to reveal how much pricing can vary from installer to installer. You can see that when you sort of look from the low end to the high end in each of these figures. The graphs here, they also do reveal, for better or for worse, how at least some installers may be reporting prices in a somewhat suspect manner, either very low or very high. though I think fortunately those cases seem to be the exception, not the rule. So, kind of putting aside those oddball cases, I think we can posit a number of reasons for why installer level pricing may vary. Some of it certainly has to do with attributes of the installers themselves. So, for example, some of the statistical studies that I mentioned earlier looked at firm size and experience and found relatively small but statistically significant effects there. Some of the other reasons for these installer level pricing differences actually really have nothing to do with the installers per se, but rather reflect other factors that are kind of correlated in some way with particular installers. So, for example, some companies may specialize in kind of custom jobs or may tend to use higher end components. Some installers may operate primarily in relatively low cost or relatively high cost markets, and so that's going to impact their pricing. And so really to tease out these various drivers does require more elaborate statistical analysis than what we've done here, and is an area that we and others are really continuing to explore. I mentioned that some installers may tend to use higher end components, and really primarily what I'm referring to there is the module technology, where there can be some rather significant differences in underlying module costs based in part on the efficiency of the module. So across our entire sample of projects in 2017, module efficiencies varied pretty widely from about 15% to 22%. And when we compare system prices based on the module efficiency, we see very little difference up to an efficiency level of, say, 19 to 20%, but then once you get above 20%, system prices jump up quite a bit. You see that in the figure on the left. And so above 20%, we're basically talking about a small handful of manufacturers that produce what are called N-type monocrystalline products, which are the most efficient and tend to sell at a pretty hefty premium over standard efficiency modules. Now, one of the arguments for installing higher efficiency modules is that they enable you to save on balance of systems costs by shrinking that project footprint. At least based on the analysis here, it does not appear that those BOS savings offset the higher cost of the modules, but there are other reasons, economic and otherwise, for why a company or a customer might opt for one of these premium efficiency module products. They can have lower degradation rates or better thermal performance. They may also come with longer warranties, and so all of that is certainly relevant to project economics. It just doesn't kind of manifest in the installed price. So the vast majority of residential systems in our data set are retrofits on existing homes. A small percentage of systems are installed on residential new construction, often in large housing developments as either a standard or an optional feature offered by the developer. And there's some reason to expect that system prices in new construction would be lower than for retrofits, given the economies of scale and scope that you might be able to obtain in a large housing development, for example. Customer acquisition costs would also presumably be lower, since you're not having to go out and market to individual customers in the same way as you would with residential retrofits. So to kind of verify those expectations, the figure here focuses on California, where we have the most data on PV in residential new construction, and it shows that indeed prices do tend to be quite a bit lower for new construction than for retrofits. The difference in 2017 is actually very large, and for various reasons I wouldn't place too much emphasis on those specific numbers, but the trend is definitely consistent across time. And in prior years, we tend to see something on the order of about a 50-cent per watt discount for systems in new construction. One of the interesting things to note is that price advantage occurs despite the fact that systems in new construction are generally quite small. Typically, they're about 3 kilowatts compared to, say, 6 kilowatts for a residential retrofit. And so, although we haven't controlled for that here, if we were to control for that, I'd expect something of a 30 to 40 cent per watt kind of additional savings associated with installations in new construction. So that prior comparison of new construction versus retrofits was focused on residential customers. For non-residential customers, one of the important distinctions among customer types is whether the site host is a for-profit commercial entity or a tax-exempt entity. As I mentioned earlier, tax-exempt customers, which include schools, government, nonprofit entities, etc., constitute about 20% of all of the non-residential systems in our sample. When we compare installed prices between tax-exempt and for-profit commercial site hosts, we find a pretty consistent trend of higher prices for tax-exempt customers. And you can see that most clearly in the figure on the left, and the differences are most pronounced for the larger non-residential systems. And there are a number of potential reasons for this. In some cases, tax-exempt site hosts may have more stringent requirements related to the use of union labor or prevailing wages, or may have requirements for domestically manufactured components. We also suspect, though unfortunately don't have really an easy way of verifying, that there's a much higher incidence of shade and parking structures among systems at tax-exempt customer sites. And so that definitely could contribute to higher prices for those systems. So just to wrap things up here with a few conclusions, this is an annual report, and so our high-level conclusions tend to be pretty similar from year to year. So basically, as we've seen, installed prices for distributed PV have fallen quite dramatically over the long run, and that trajectory in recent years has continued, but at a relatively slow pace. Historically, those declines in installed prices have come from both reductions in hardware costs and reductions in soft costs, with a somewhat greater contribution on the hardware side. Going forward, however, for any really dramatic further reductions in system pricing to occur, it's going to necessarily have to come mostly on the soft cost side, and that's just for the very basic arithmetic reason that hardware costs represent just a small fraction of overall system costs, especially for residential and smaller non-residential systems. The good news, I think, is that we do see plenty of evidence that much lower soft costs are possible. We see that both in the much lower prices that are observed in other countries, as well as in the U.S., where we see a large fraction of systems that are being installed at prices well below national medians. And so really the question is just how to reproduce and replicate those conditions more broadly. The challenge in doing that is that soft costs are, by their nature, very diverse and diffuse, and often sort of localized in terms of the underlying drivers. And so addressing these issues, it requires innovation and research across a whole range of different aspects of the PV industry and business operations, and really kind of understanding how to move the market towards kind of a more efficient and kind of competitive structure. And this is an area that we are continuing to do a lot of exploration and will continue to look at in the future. So with that, I will thank you all. We've only got about 10 minutes or so left for Q&A. I know Naeem has been queuing up some of those questions. Before doing that, though, I do just want to highlight here again the website where you can get the report, the webinar recording, the data set, etc. You can also sign up for our email list there. And with that, I will hand the baton over to Naeem for some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Galen. Yeah, we have a number of questions here, and please do keep sending questions in the question and answer box at the bottom of the screen. So there are actually two questions about the data file that's online. If you could provide kind of more details on what's included in the online data file, what kinds of fields are included, that'd be great.
Yep, no, I can do that. So as I mentioned sort of early on in the presentation, we kind of have two different versions of the data set. There's the full data sample, which has basically 1.3 million systems, and then a smaller analysis sample that we use for the analysis of installed pricing trends. The public data set we posted online is basically the full data sample. We have scrubbed out some confidential data. There are a few of the data providers that send us data that is subject to a non-disclosure agreement, and so we've removed that data. And so, what's contained in that data file is, still roughly 1.3 million systems or so, and it includes data fields on system price, install date, system size, lots of information on the module and inverter manufacturer and model. I think probably 50 to 60 data fields are included in total. There's a user guide that we've posted along with the data file. So I think if you download it, it's a zip file that's got both a CSV, which is the data, and then like a PDF file, which is the user guide. And that user guide, it has a table listing all of the data fields and kind of explaining what they are. So definitely look at that before you get yourself too confused with our kind of cryptic data headers.
Great. So there's one question about how the soft costs appear to make up the bulk of the price differences between U.S. and international residential solar. The person was wondering if LBNL or someone else has done research into the difference in installer profit margins between U.S. and international installers, and I guess to that effect, any other differences.
There definitely have been some studies that have tried to understand kind of broadly the reasons for pricing differences between different countries. We actually did a study maybe 4 years ago or 5 years ago that was focused on comparing the U.S. and Germany. And we didn't focus or really isolate differences in installer profit margins. We did, as I recall, kind of separately estimate the differences in customer acquisition costs, in costs associated with permitting and interconnection, and installation labor costs, I think was the third bucket. And then there was sort of a fourth catch-all bucket that included profit margins as well as sort of other administrative costs. And that catch-all bucket was, I think, ultimately the largest source of difference between the U.S. and Germany when we did this study back in 2014. So I think there's definitely there would be some value in refreshing that and in trying to understand how much of it has to do with installer profitability. Certainly, the installer business models do differ between the U.S. and other countries. I think one of the things that we found in looking at Germany is that these are mostly kind of mom and pop installers. They're not necessarily trying to grow their business in some massive way. Often they may be PV installers and also electrical companies, and so they often had lower overhead costs because they weren't kind of growth focused. So I think there's definitely some interesting stuff that can be done there. There have been, I would just mention, a number of other studies that Rocky Mountain Institute has done, along with some other institutions, focusing on installation labor in particular, and doing some time and motion studies. So that obviously is not related to installer profit margins, but in terms of studies that are out there, that's another body of work that I would point people towards if you're interested in kind of understanding some of the underlying drivers.
Great. So you mentioned that some system installation costs for nonprofits included parking structures. Are there any systems in your data that may include storage? And if not, do you plan on including PV and storage systems in the future?
No, that's a great question. So we, to the extent that we identify systems that had storage, we removed them from the data set, just because we wanted to focus really solely on the installed price of standalone PV systems. But I think we definitely are planning going forward to retain those systems and to break them out in some way. We haven't figured out exactly how to do that yet. I think the main challenge is just being able to identify which of the systems have storage, because many of the data providers that we get our data from, that's not a field that they necessarily track. But I think going forward, as storage becomes more common, hopefully that's something that will be tracked more consistently by the individual utilities and state agencies that are collecting this information that will then kind of feed into our analysis.
There's a question on whether we have any insights why the market party-owned systems has been decreasing in recent years.
I mean, so I can sort of simply relay what I myself have read in the trade press and what other analysts have put out, and I think basically as I understand it, other financing options have become more prevalent. So property assessed clean energy, PACE financing has grown in some markets. More significantly probably is the emergence of loan products, solar loan products, which have really taken off and have presumably taken some of the market share away from third-party owned systems.
There are two questions here, basically asking about value-based pricing. So one is, have you studied or identified changes in system pricing after retail utility rate changes? And another is related to higher prices in states that may have higher incentives. Have we? Are there any kind of auxiliary studies around value-based pricing?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and definitely something we've looked at. Probably the study that I would point you to that addresses that most directly. So I've clicked here onto this slide that lists off various studies that we've done with some academic partners. And so the one in the middle, Gillingham et al., 2014, that was sort of a everything in the kitchen sink econometric study where we really just tried to understand what's driving prices and pricing differences. And we did, in that study, regress system prices against the sort of aggregate value of all incentives. So bill savings from net metering, plus any rebates, plus any tax incentives. For each system, we basically estimated the total value of all of those incentives together and looked at how that impacts pricing. And we found basically a 40-cent per watt effect between sort of systems with the lowest versus systems with the highest value of incentives. So there definitely is some effect. I think where the subtlety comes in is whether this is value-based pricing, in other words, installers sort of just marking up their prices based on what they think consumers are willing to pay, versus, and this is a little bit more sort of subtle and difficult to articulate, but where you've got rich incentives, you're going to have higher demand for PV. And if you've got higher demand, think back to microeconomics 101 and imagine just sort of a generic upward sloping supply curve. as as you move to the right on that upward sloping supply curve with a greater quantity, you're moving to higher and higher priced suppliers. And so in markets where you've got rich incentives, you're also going to tend to have kind of overheated demand, which is going to allow higher priced installers to basically get by. And so that may also be why we tend to see higher prices in some of these kind of in states or regions with richer incentives.
Great, and with that, it is now the bottom of the hour and the top of the new hour, and we're going to be concluding the webinar. The webinar, again, has been recorded and will be on trackingthesun.lbl.gov for future reference. Thank you so much, and have a great day.